Now, where we used to live, they had this, we had this house at the edge of town where we lived, and there was this hill at the end of a farm lane. And that was kind of the edge of the town. It was farmland and wild country out from there, and there was these, great expanses of sagebrush. And one time, a mom dropped by the house with a whole bushel of her boys, and while Lisi was working on some food, the boys kind of got to roughhouse, and so I had an idea. I said, hey boys, why don't we go for a little walk? Why don't we walk down this lane, and let's see what's on the other side of that hill. So that's what we did. We started walking. We went down this lane, and it really wasn't that far, and it was just, right outside the edge of town. It wasn't like we were going off into the wilderness, but for these boys, it became this epic quest. It was a journey. And we didn't know what we were going to find on the other side of that hill. And honestly, I didn't know what was on the other side of the hill either. So we started walking, and as it was cold and the wind was blowing, we started going up over the hill, and they were ready to turn back. But I'm like, come on, boys, a little farther, let's do this. And we got to the top of the hill, and we looked out, and we saw more hills kind of just going off. And I said, all right, we can turn around and go back now. And we got back as quick as we could and got warmed up inside and had some supper. But it's a little bit like those magi. They saw that star rising in the east, and they didn't know what they were going to find on the other side of that star, and they set out on an epic quest. And they were seeking God and following this sign that God found, and along the way, they bumped right into Jesus, and they worshiped him. And I think it's a little bit like that for us in this new year, and I hope that we can be refocused on our quest after God and our need to come to Jesus and to worship him in this new year. I hope we can get refocused on that. Now in verse 2 of this chapter, and we're going to go right through it, in verse 2 it says that the Magi saw a star in the east. Now for these Magi, it was never just about astronomy. Right? They weren't just sky watching. They weren't just following a star. It wasn't just curiosity. They were looking for a sign from God. And so these Magi were on a quest, and it was a spiritual quest, right? They set out from their homeland, and maybe their homeland was Babylon. In the book of Daniel, it talks about Magi, uses that same word. They're kind of these people who are astrologers. Sometimes they're magicians, but they're these folks who come from the east. They're following this star. They follow this sign God's given them. And they had to make some sacrifices to seek God. This was their quest. They had to do some hard things. I mean, these men risked life and limb. They gave up the comfort of their own home. They crossed mountains and deserts, and they might have had to do what was the hardest and most painful of all. They had to do math to be able to figure out do the calculations, right? Do the math. Where's that star leading them? The quest the Magi were on was to seek God and to worship them. And I think this is a quest for all of us, seek God and worship him, especially in this new year. The Magi had a star to follow. What's the star that God's sending you? Where is God leading you in this new year? Where's God's sign to you? Now, we honestly don't know that much about the Magi. I mean, Christian tradition has called them the three kings. Sometimes we talk about January 6th, Epiphany, as Three Kings Day. In some countries, they give gifts on Three Kings Day. The Magi show up with gifts. And people have reasoned that because they had to go on such a long trek to be able to follow this star, that they must have been men of some wealth. They must have had maybe some servants to come along with them, and that's usually how they've been painted, riding on camels, coming in this caravan, the three kings. But as most of you will know, if you have read this passage carefully, we really don't know that there are three, though the Gospels do talk about three gifts. And we really don't know when they arrived. I mean, we often paint them as arriving on the same night as the shepherds on that very night when Jesus was born, but it could have been many months later, maybe a year or so later. And I noticed that Mary and Joseph, they're still in Bethlehem, so I suspect it wasn't too much later. Verse 11, though, does say that they came to a house, which makes us think that it's not just that little stable anymore. It's a house. Maybe they've picked up and got better digs since Jesus was born. But it's interesting that they show up first, these magi, they show up first in Jerusalem. And it's interesting that their asking around attracts the attention of King Herod. And it does make you kind of think that they would have been men of stature, maybe even kings, because Herod takes note of them. And after consulting with the teachers of the law about where the Messiah would be born, he sends out the Magi with directions for Bethlehem. He gives them an audience and sends them out. He talks to them. And he requests that they let him know when they find the infant Messiah. That's in verse 8. Herod sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." And then verse 9, the Magi set out. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. So they follow the star. It stops over the place where the child was. It's kind of this mysterious star. They're doing their astrological calculations. Verse 10, look at their response. Verse 10, when they saw the star, look at the response, they were overjoyed. They rejoice, it's literally, they rejoice with exceedingly great joy. They have this joy. When they come to the house, they find Mary with little Jesus on her lap, and they immediately bow down and they worship him and they give him gifts. And do you remember what the gifts are here, right? You learned this in Sunday school. They give him gifts. It's the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. And we don't know how long they hung out after that, though we do know that there was at least one night, because then God gives them this dream not to return to Herod. They're to go back to their country by another way. And these magi, they go on a quest to find the newborn king, this quest to see where God is leading them. It's really a quest to find God, and along the way they find Jesus. And that's no accident. I mean, we will not be able to find our way to God without coming through Jesus. That's where that road always leads. There's no quest for God that doesn't lead through Jesus. And this is why Jesus said in the Gospel of John, "I am the way and the truth of the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." It wasn't that he was trying to be exclusive or something. He's just stating the facts. There is no quest for God that doesn't end up being a quest for Jesus. And these magi, they set out following a star that God has placed for them to discover. It was God's sign. Go looking, go searching, go seeking, go see what I have for you. Come and find me, says God. Do you see my star? And that star was a sign for them. It was God's invitation for them. God called to them. God saying to them, here it is. Go take a look at it. It's right over there for you to see. It's kind of like that angel that appeared to the shepherds. Remember that? We looked at this a couple weeks ago. Out on that field while they're watching their flocks, the angel's like, go to Bethlehem. Check it out. Go and see. Because God's always calling people to go and see, to try him out, to take a look. Do you see that star? And God called these magi on a quest. And it's a quest. I don't know how you feel about quests. I think a lot of times we're pretty comfortable where we are. I mean, we're pretty content to stay home, stay comfortable, stay safe. We'd rather not go off chasing after any stars, thank you very much. And I think a lot of times we want God to come to us rather than us going to God. But God's not really interested in armchair believers. God's interested in calling us out of ourselves, sending us out, pointing us down this path with the star. God desires that people seek him. God desires that people quest after him. This is why the prophet Isaiah says in the Old Testament, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." This is why Moses told the Israelites in Deuteronomy, "From there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and your soul." It's why David prayed, saying, "Seek the Lord in his strength, seek his presence continually." It's why Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." We're called to be people who seek God, who seek after God. We're people on a quest for God. Think of Abram. Abram or Abraham in the Old Testament. God spoke to him. God said, Abram, I'm going to give you all this land. God said, I'm going to bless you, Abram. I'm going to bless the whole world through you. But God didn't just drop that all into Abram's lap. God said, I'm going to bless you. Now go. Go to the land that I will show you. God sent Abram out onto this quest, and it wasn't just a quest after land, it was a quest really after God. Now, questing after God is not easy, it's not comfortable, it's not safe. The first thing going on a quest requires is the same thing that was required of the Magi. I mean, just kind of think about these Magi. Imagine them back in their home country. Before they go on a quest, imagine the first thing that they had to do. They had to see that star, and this means that the first thing they had to do was look up. The Magi had to pay attention, to wake up from what was going on around them and notice that there is a star. They had to see that there was something that they needed to pay attention to. Now, I'm guessing that those Magi did not know what they were headed out after. I mean, how could they? They weren't Jewish. They followed some kind of ancient pagan faith. Now, perhaps they had studied some of the Hebrew scriptures, and perhaps they had read the prophecy of Balaam in Numbers that says, a star shall come out of Jacob. But they were not Jewish. They didn't know the full understanding of what they were seeking. And part of what Epiphany that we're celebrating today, part of what it means is that it's this moment when Jesus is revealed not just as the King of Israel, King of the Jews, but the King and Savior of all people. And so these Magi are the first fruits from among the nations. They are people who come seeking Jesus. It's just like the prophet Zechariah, who prophesied so many years before this in chapter 8:23 of Zechariah, that people from nations of every language shall take hold of a Jew, grasping his garment and saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. The Magi saw that star and they went out with it. We want to see God. It's not easy to follow a star. You know, anytime we take seriously where God's leading us, we're going to encounter some opposition. There are going to be diversions and distractions. There are challenges on our quest. Now, when we were back in Illinois over our little Christmas break here, visiting family, we went to a planetarium. Do you know what a planetarium is? Ever been to a planetarium? Yeah, you probably know. We've been to a planetarium. It's this place where you kind of sit back in your chair and you look up at this curved roof and they project onto the roof the image of the night sky. And they can tell you about the stars. So we went to this planetarium over Christmas and they taught us about like how to locate the North Star. And they said, all right, what you're going to do is you're going to look for the Big Dipper, and then you're going to trace up and you're going to find the tail of the Little Dipper, and that is the North Star. If you know where the North Star is, like as the Earth goes around its orbit around the sun, the North Star pretty much stays in the north, and you can know that direction is north. Now, so I came back here to Kansas, and I was locking my chickens up at night, and I looked to the north, and I couldn't see the Big Dipper or the Little Dipper or the North Star. And the reason for that is because from where I stand, there's a street light, and then there's some other lights from houses and whatnot, and it kind of fills the whole horizon with the glow, and it's called light pollution. So it kind of blocks out your view, and you can't see the star. You can't see that North Star. It's this haze, and when you look up, it obscures your view. Now think about this. The Magi could have lost sight of their star along the way because of light pollution, because of mountains, because of things that blocked their view. They could have got discouraged. They could have faced opposition. There could have been this light pollution, this haze that obscured their vision. They could have decided they were on a fool's errand. Or, they could have been wooed by Herod and just stayed in that palace rather than going looking for this poor family in a humble home. But they didn't. They kept on. And at the end of their story in the Gospel of Matthew, they are so in tune to God that God speaks to them through a dream. And they know that it's God, and God tells them to go home by another route to avoid Herod. Those magi could have got thrown off by light pollution. They could have lost sight of the star, but they didn't. What's your light pollution? What is hazing up the sky for you so that you can't see that star? What's distracting you from going out there and seeking God? What's your light pollution? Are you afraid? Are you disappointed? Are you worn out? Are you feeling helpless? Is your heart broken like mine is by the events of this weekend with this little boy and his mother who slipped through the ice? I think all of us are trying to make sense of that tragedy, and we might be thinking, all right, God, where does your star lead through that? And really, almost anything we say will come off as glib. This kind of thing shakes our sense of justice, our sense of safety, our faith. And yesterday, Lisi and I went down to Pack Park, and we just kind of stood on the edge of that icy water and prayed and cried. But I'm convinced of God's leading and presence even through the worst situations. I'm convinced of God's unfailing love for us and for this mother and child and for all who were impacted. And I'm convinced that there are moments when we have to keep our eyes fixed on Christ, and that in fact it's in those hardest times when we need to follow the star to Christ. Maybe you look up. Maybe you look up and you don't even think there is a star. Maybe you feel, God, or are you listening? Are you out there? I could use a little guidance. I could use a little help. But my question is, what's the light pollution that's keeping you from questing after God? Think about Abraham again. God told him that he would give him a son. God told Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be more than the sand of the seashore. But Abraham was old, and his wife Sarah was old, and their age was really their light pollution. It kept them from being able to see God's promise and really go after it. What's the light pollution for you? What's holding you back? What's hard for you to follow God's star? Magi go questing for God, and they find Jesus. And notice their reaction to Jesus. This passage is really all about verse 11. It says, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and incense of frankincense and of myrrh. They bow down and they worship him. They give him gifts. And this is the thing, seeking God is always going to find its meaning and its purpose in worship. And anybody can entertain ideas about God, thoughts about God. Anybody can have philosophies of who God might be. But God doesn't just call us to think about him. God calls us to bow down and worship. And like people in the Old Testament who brought gifts from their flocks, gifts from their herds, gifts from their first fruits, these magi brought gifts to lay at Jesus' feet. They worshiped this child in Mary's arms. Worship is what we always bring to God. It's the only response that's enough. And everyone in the world has to respond to Jesus in some way or another because he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He is the one who's at the right hand of the Father. He's the one in whom all things hold together. But it's really worship that sets off people who think Jesus is a curiosity from those who love him. But everyone responds to Jesus at some point in some way. In this passage, even Herod makes a response to Jesus. Herod asks the teachers, he says, tell me more about what the scriptures say about Christ. Herod is curious about these magi who are seeking Christ. He wants to hear about their spiritual journey. But Herod doesn't seek out Jesus to worship him. Herod tries to kill him. And in one of the saddest events in the Gospels, a short time after the Magi leave Jesus, Herod orders all baby boys under 2 killed in and around Bethlehem, all because he's anxious and fearful that another king will come along and take his throne in Jerusalem. So Herod responds to Jesus. He wants to get rid of him. But the Magi, on the other hand, they bring him gifts. And the scriptures say that they opened their treasures and presented Jesus with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense and myrrh were both products of trees. They're used as incense or as spices. When the queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon in the Old Testament, she brought him gold and spices. When Isaiah prophesies that the kings of the nations will seek God, he says that they'll come bearing gold and frankincense, and they'll proclaim the praise of the Lord. Some people have seen symbolic meaning in these gifts: the gold for royalty, the frankincense for divinity, the myrrh as a reminder that Jesus will give his life for his people. It could be. Or it just might be that they're expensive gifts, gifts that express the Magi's commitment to honor the newborn king. The Magi sought Jesus, and they came honoring him with their gifts. So what gift do you bring? Because you can tell a lot about what we're committed to by where we place our gifts. Where do we put our money? In a lot of ways, that's what is going to matter most to us. I mean, this is one of the reasons that if we're serious about following Jesus, we've also got to be serious about tithing. Because our heart will go where our money does. That's why Jesus said, where our treasure is, there your heart will be also. And the Magi knew this. They brought their gifts to honor the newborn king. But it's not about just money. It's about all the ways that we bring our gifts to honor Jesus. It's about how we give our time. It's about how we don't just say we're committed, but we actually get some skin in the game. I don't know about you, but if you remember back to after 9/11, there was this time when, all of our hearts were going out to people who had lost their lives, families that had lost loved ones, and at least where we were at, everybody started giving blood. Was it like that around here? It was like give blood as a way to support victims of 9/11. And that always stuck with me, it intrigued me, because it seemed like it was this way, this deep sense that everyone had, that our hearts are there, we want to get some skin in the game, we want to literally give blood, get some blood in this, to show where our commitment is, show what we care about. And this is really what it comes down to. The Magi don't just seek Jesus. They're not just curious about Jesus. They give gifts. They put something on the line for Jesus. They go through discomfort. They follow that star. They open up their treasures, and they give him gold and frankincense and myrrh. And God doesn't just want our treasures and our time. God really wants much more than that gold and frankincense and myrrh. God wants us. So where are you at? What about you? Do you see that star? As we enter into this new year, are you on a quest to find God? Are you ready to meet Jesus and to bow down and to worship him? Are you ready to open up your treasures and to present him with your gifts? Thanks be to God. Amen.